Vladimir Lenin, who brought communism to Russia, is pulled off his pedestal. For a moment, in an ending totally without dignity, he hangs by his feet.
From ABC News. This week with David Brinkley. Now, from our Washington headquarters, here's David Brinkley.
In one of the Russian republics, people gathered in the street in front of the Communist Party headquarters and laughed. They saw a Communist Party that began in tragedy, ending in farce. The beginning of the party's end came when the two leaders of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin and Gorbachev, ordered the party banned. Even before that, it was weak, bankrupt, and no longer a force. Seldom in Western history or any history have so many momentous events happened so fast. Events that raise hopes for the future of the Soviet people and everyone else. We'll explore all this with today's guests. James A. Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State. Andrei Kozyrev in Moscow, Foreign Minister of Boris Yeltsin's Russian Republic. And Igor Malashenko, a spokesman for the Soviet Union's President Gorbachev. Some background on a week of explosive developments from our man Jack Smith. And our discussion here, George Will is on vacation, with Sam Donaldson, Cokie Roberts, and ABC's chief foreign correspondent, Pierre Salinger, all here on our Sunday program. First, the news since the Sunday morning papers. Marshal Sergei Akrameyev, the senior military advisor to President Gorbachev, committed suicide in Moscow last night. It is not clear that he was involved in the coup. He was a hardliner who worked with Gorbachev on the nuclear arms treaty. Now the Soviet military's high command is devastated. The defense minister, Yazov, one of the plotters, is under arrest. General Moiseyev, the Army's chief of staff, stripped of his command and all of his powers. Akrameyev was 68. ABC's Jim Laurie, our Moscow correspondent, has been there through all these astonishing events, and you've seen him on the air here day and night. Jim, bring us up to date, will you?
David, President Gorbachev has spent all day today in his Kremlin office with advisors. He is preparing for a session tomorrow of the National Supreme Soviet, the Soviet Parliament, where he will present an accounting of just what he has learned about the background to the attempted coup d'etat. He will also be justifying the appointments that he has made and justifying the actions he has taken against the Communist Party and the actions he has taken in concert with Boris Yeltsin. At the same time, there are some other developments around the nation today. For example, in Belarusia, the leader there has quit his job under a cloud because of his backing for the coup. And also in Moldavia, they are discussing this coming week a declaration of independence. In fact, all of the republics are taking advantage of the weakened Kremlin leadership to discuss independence. David?
Well, Jim, in the past, plotters like these would have been shot. What do you suppose they will do to them now? A little jail time?
Well, it is only speculation, but the key plotters are seen to be the KGB chief Khrushchev and General Yazov, and there is a great deal of talk here that these two men may well indeed face the death penalty. The others may simply face prison terms.
Jim, thank you. Thanks very much. The other news, Raisa Gorbachev is not well and is staying home. Her husband's office announced, no details given. Several European countries announced they would recognize Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia as independent countries. The United States always has recognized them, but it appeared today as if it will soon have full independence. China is so worried about the events in the Soviet Union, it is warning its province along the Russian border not to stray from the communist road. We'll be back with all the rest of today's program in a moment.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by GE. From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life. And by ADM, supermarket to the world.
John Reed, an early American communist, was also a journalist of sorts and was in Leningrad in 1917 when the Bolsheviks stormed the Tsar's Winter Palace and seized power. and he wrote the best eyewitness account in a book called 10 Days That Shook the World. Now, if he were alive, he could add a final chapter and call it about 5 days, maybe, that unshook the world, describing how the Communist Party came to disgrace in the country where it was born. Before we question our guests, Jack Smith has some background. Jack?
David, Mikhail Gorbachev's resignation from the Communist Party this weekend and his suggestion it be dissolved were the latest aftershocks of the failed coup this week that altered the political face of the Soviet Union.
I think today is the end of the communists.
It's quite time for communism to die in Russia and in Soviet Union too.
Throughout the Soviet state this week, symbols of the old order came tumbling down. Statues of Lenin, of Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the secret police. Everywhere, party headquarters were forced to shut down, and the printing presses of Pravda, the official party newspaper, was stopped as well. The old pre-revolutionary Russian flag came out to replace the hammer and sickle, and reformers were named to head the Interior Ministry, the Army, and the KGB, the apparatus of control.
The coup has destroyed the old totalitarian empire and everything associated with it.
The failure of the coup is expected to accelerate the pace of reform and the breakup of the Soviet state.
The central power is going to be weaker. I don't think there's really very much doubt about that, because the republics have really flexed their muscle now, especially the Russian Republic.
The Russian Republic, it has 76% of the Soviet Union's landmass and 51% of its population. And its charismatic leader, Boris Yeltsin, who personally rallied popular opposition to the coup, has emerged as the clear political winner. Mikhail Gorbachev, returning to Moscow after 3 days of house arrest, has been the loser.
The big loser. He was already very weak politically before the coup. I think he's now going to be even weaker.
Not only did he get some blame, after all, he'd promoted the very man who staged the coup, but his initial defense of the Communist Party showed he was in danger of becoming irrelevant. Listen to this close aide of Boris Yeltsin's.
We shall be entitled to dictate our own conditions as to what shape and rate the reform in our country will have.
Indeed, Friday, appearing before the Russian state parliament, Gorbachev's choices for a new cabinet were overruled. He was heckled, and when he balked at reading a document out loud, Yeltsin told him, "Read it." And a clearly uncomfortable Gorbachev did so. His best option now, according to some, is to become a figurehead.
To act like the Queen of England and say, okay, I will preside over a commonwealth. And that might hold in some way the different republics together.
And I assured Mr. Yeltsin.
U.S. policy began shifting to accommodate the emergence of Yeltsin, a man the White House once dismissed as a fool, but not anymore.
It would be extremely unfortunate if the administration continued to be personality-driven, except they shifted from one personality, that of Gorbachev, to another, that of Yeltsin.
The attempted coup is also expected to rekindle the differences at last month's economic summit over giving more aid to Moscow, something favored by the Allies, but not, as Secretary of State James Baker repeated this week, by the U.S., which feels first there have to be changes.
There has to be fundamental free market economic reform adopted in the Soviet Union.
Forgotten in all the week's images is the fact that during the coup, most Russians were not on the street. In food stores just 15 minutes from the Kremlin, shoppers stood in line sometimes 8 hours to get basic necessities. Economic conditions are worse than in the Great Depression. Unless food gets on the table soon, reform this winter could become just as discredited as communism is this weekend. For the moment, though, the Soviet people and the rest of the world are fixed on the fact that 74 years after its birth there, communism in the Soviet Union is dying. David?
Jack, thank you. Coming next, Igor Malashenko, who is a spokesman for Soviet President Gorbachev, and shortly, Andrei Kozyrev, foreign minister of Boris Yeltsin's Russian Republic, and James A. Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State. In a moment. Mr. Malashenko in Moscow, thank you very much for coming in to talk with us today.
It's a pleasure.
We're glad to have you with us. Here in our studio are Cokie Roberts and Sam Donaldson, both of ABC News. Now tell me, if the Communist Party is dying and threatened with disappearing, as we hear, what is going to take its place? Maybe over a long term, some other more democratic parties. But in the meantime, who's going to run the Soviet Union?
In the meantime, the Soviet Union is going to be run by constitutional authorities, by President Gorbachev, by Boris Yeltsin and leaders of the Republic. But actually, the virtual disbandment of the Communist Party creates a power vacuum, and in the longer run, it's going to be probably another party, or I do hope a number of parties, a multi-party system of democratic orientation with different names, but apparently it will take time.
Well, the people who have lived in a one-party state for 74 years, I think it is there anyone there who knows how to do it?
It's one of the major problems, because the most of people know only one party, the Communist Party, as it existed for so many decades. So the natural tendency for many people is to reproduce basically the same party under any other name. But on the other hand, there is a very strong democratic development in the Soviet Union, and for the last few years, the popular attitudes and even the political culture itself has changed enormously, and it gives a hope that the totalitarian party is not going to emerge again in the Soviet Union, but a multi-party system, a really democratic system, will take place here.
Mr. Malashenko, we were getting reports this morning that there was some confusion in Moscow, that tanks were moving again and that people were very upset, and then that was not true. But is that atmosphere still there? Are people concerned that another coup could happen at any moment?
That's a problem, actually. There was just a rumor. There was no substance to it, but people still are very tense and nervous, and they're still very excited. It's in some respects, it's still an explosive atmosphere, and it will take quite a while, I do believe, to calm it down. But I do not expect any major public disturbances or something. But unfortunately, we should be ready for some rumors to appear again from time to time. I think it's understandable after this coup.
In an effort to quell that and to rid yourselves of what you were just talking about, another totalitarian situation, do you have any fear that what could emerge here now is a witch hunt, that you will be going after the communists, to people who have been communist in the past?
No, I wouldn't describe the situation as another witch hunt. There is a number of statements to this effect in the Soviet media, and I think that in itself it's a reassuring development. The witch hunt is not here, but people are aware of this danger, and they're ready and willing to avert it and not to have a return to our past.
Let me ask you about Marshal Akrameyev. He committed suicide, we understand. How did he do it, and why did he do it?
The why is obviously the most difficult question, and we don't know it at this moment, but I do believe that we'll learn it shortly. He did it yesterday, late evening, in his Kremlin office. I do not have any further details.
Did he shoot him? Did he shoot himself? Did he shoot himself?
He did indeed.
He put a gun to his head?
I cannot say it so specifically to his head or to his heart. These details are not available right now, but that's the fact, and
did he leave?
I can confirm it.
Did he leave any message for President Gorbachev? Did he leave any note?
At this particular moment, I don't know, because any information about it was not made public.
All right, let me ask you about Raisa Gorbachev. She's ill. We hear that she's had a heart attack. There is even a report she had a stroke. What are the facts?
Well, the facts are that really she is not well. She has not been well quite for a while, and she was undergoing treatment. But earlier this day she talked, this is the only information I have, she talked to the press secretary to the president, to Mr. Ignatenko. She said that she is doing much better now, but that she is still under medical observation, from her physician. Well, I think that the very fact of this conversation is reassuring, but we don't have any specific medical information at the moment.
Let me ask you a final question. Mr. Gorbachev has now outlawed the Communist Party because Mr. Yeltsin clearly told him to do it. Mr. Yeltsin has recognized the Baltic states. When will President Gorbachev recognize the independence of the Baltic states?
President Gorbachev has stepped down as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and he called the Central Committee to disband on itself. And from my point of view, the Communist Party, as we knew it, is non-existent. It is not outlawed in this sense. As to the Baltics, I think that it is clear that President Gorbachev accepted quite a while ago basically their right for independence, and I do believe that their movement towards independence from the Soviet Union will go in a much more rapid way now. There is still a number of legal and political and economic problems to be settled, and it needs time, these problems, to be managed, but I do believe that this process will be much more speedier now.
Mr. Malashenko, thank you. Thanks very much for coming in today. Pleased to have you with us. Coming next, Andrei Kozyrev, who is Foreign Minister of Boris Yeltsin's Russian Republic, and shortly, our own Secretary of State, James A. Baker. In a moment. Mr. Kozyrev, in Moscow, in the Yeltsin government. Thank you for coming in. Pleased to have you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you. Now, listen, you work with Mr. Yeltsin's government. Tell us, what is he going to do now? What are his immediate plans? What will he do today, tomorrow?
First of all, I would like to express our deep thanks, both of President Yeltsin and our government and really Russian people, to Americans, to Secretary Baker and to President Bush, to everyone, for the support, and we now know who our friends are, and this will be one of the immediate concerns for us, to change fundamentally the foreign policy of the Soviet Union and of Russia in order to recognize openly that the Western democracies are our best friends and not some ideological, residual at least, ideological opponents. And in internal policies it will be as radical change for further reforms along the line pluralistic democracy, dismantlement of the totalitarian and unitary state, which was mistakenly known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was rather evil empires that was once put, and we will do whatever is needed to provide pluralistic democracy, market-oriented economy. It is no easy task. It is no time for euphoria, of course, but we will do everything, and we count on your support.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Now, tell me this: what will you do next? What's the first thing that happens?
Now we will be looking that the union structures. The government of the Soviet Union is a government of public support and public trust, and not the residual mechanism of totalitarian or the power of communist nomenclature, even not called communist anymore. So our immediate concern is to provide the government of popular trust, and the government which will be the vehicle for democratic reforms, as I mentioned.
Mr. Kozyrev, when the coup occurred, you were sent to Paris to form, if necessary, a government in exile. First of all, what happened? What were your expectations there? And when you met with Secretary Baker, what kinds of commitments did you get from him?
Well, we counted on Western democracies, and this proved to be true. I was very well received in France, and not Soviet embassy. Soviet embassy didn't even show to me, but the French Quai d'Orsay was a very great help to me, and the American embassy in Paris was very helpful to send message, not, again I stress, not through the Soviet Union's foreign ministry, but through the embassy of United States in Paris, we communicated with Secretary Baker, and so we found what we expected to find, and we will be grateful for this. As to the government in exile, yes, there was a potential possibility for this. It was in my, so to say, in my credentials, but I never used it because I was pretty sure, and I told it to everyone, including Western press, that I was pretty sure that the government of President Yeltsin will prevail. My count was 7 days. I was mistaken.
Now, to have that government prevail, clearly you're going to have to deliver at some point. How much does that require Western aid? Do you need Western aid for your government to be able to succeed?
Yes, we need, first of all, understanding. Then we will need some specific aid, but not the type it was used last year. Now that we are friends, allow me some small criticism. If the formula is that Gorbachev is back, and now what we can do to help Gorbachev, my suggestion is to change it a little bit and say, yes, Gorbachev back, Yeltsin prevailed, but what we can do to help reform. So any help, any aid should not be given to wrong hands, should be very well thought of and provided in a transparent and verifiable manner.
Does that mean not given to Gorbachev? That means given to the republics?
It means given to the mechanisms and forces which can really deliver reforms and which are determined to reform this country, well, not just speak of reforms.
Mr. Kozyrev, the mechanisms and forces, the view here now is that Yeltsin is really the top power in Moscow, the man who is calling the shots. Would you disagree with that?
Well, I think he deserves it for his courage, because the White House in Moscow withstood and now symbolizes, to, I believe, democracy as White House in Washington.
Well, what precisely then, if you don't disagree with that, is this coalition government like between Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev? In reality, you seem to be saying that it is Boris Yeltsin's government and Mikhail Gorbachev will do what he's told.
Mikhail Gorbachev, as you know, is a legitimate president of USSR, and Yeltsin from the very beginning, and when I get to the West, it was also my first words that our immediate purpose is reinstall legitimate power of President Gorbachev. What I'm speaking now, that you cannot enter in the same waters twice, and that people are now not prepared to go on with the hesitant policies by anyone, by either Yeltsin or Gorbachev or anyone. So what I'm speaking of is now the time to determined effort by Gorbachev, by Yeltsin, and by everyone else.
Well, I believe that the Russian Republic has already recognized the Baltic states as independent governments. There's a big push suddenly among the EC nations to do that. Would you think that the United States ought to now move forward and recognize those three republics as independent states?
This question is clear for us. Yesterday, Yeltsin signed a decree recognizing independence of 2 Baltic states, and the third, Lithuania, is coming very shortly. It is just that 2 delegations of those states were in Moscow. But you know what were first words of the heads of those delegations after signing of Yeltsin this recognition of independence? It was not farewell. It was now we start to cooperate with Russian people, Russia, in all fields, in economic, in cultural, in humanitarian.
I understand, sir.
So it is not disintegration.
I understand, sir, but my question was, do you think the United States ought to do the same thing now?
It's up to the United States. I understand they never ceased to recognize the Baltic states, but certainly we would welcome any determined effort to put it in a more practical way. We are going to establish diplomatic relations with them.
Mr. Kozyrev, one last question. Are you going to have food and clothes and so on in the stores this coming winter?
Well, this is one of the modalities, so to say, of aid which I would probably count on, but put in a different way than last year. Last year there was a humanitarian aid provided through central bureaucracy, and this probably disappeared or even was misused. You know that after that the junta was, at least majority of them were appointed to their posts. So now we would call for a fund to help democracy, and probably we will call the Western public opinion, the private organizations, even governments, to provide it, but through a mechanism which will be transparent, which will be verifiable, as I said, and jointly controlled by democratic institutions in the West and democratic institutions in Russia and in other republics, in order that this help, this food, for instance, will be delivered to the real people.
Mr.
This we
Kozyrev,
will welcome, certainly.
Mr. Kozyrev, thank you. Thanks very much for coming in and talking with us. It's been interesting, and we're grateful to you.
Thank you.
Coming next, the U.S. Secretary of State, James A. Baker, who is on vacation in Wyoming. In a moment. Mr. Secretary, in Pinedale, Wyoming, with Lake Fremont there behind you, sure you want to come back to Washington? It's so beautiful
well,
there.
I just came back this week, David, as you know, to Washington, to Kennebunkport, and to Brussels, but I'll be back soon.
Well, you got a phone call the other day, which all of us watched one end of, from Besmertnik telling you that he'd been fired. We heard about the phone call. We don't know what you said to him. Could you tell us now? You said he'd been fired.
He said he had been asked to resign, that he had resigned. He said that he was going to continue to work for progress toward perestroika and reform in whatever capacity he occupied next. That he did not think, I asked him specifically if he felt that there would be any change in the foreign policy approach of the Soviet Union, with particular reference to the possibility of promoting peace in the Middle East. He said he did not think that there would be any change, and he felt that the Soviet Union would be every bit as inclined to try and cooperate with the United States and other countries to promote peace in the Middle East as they had been before.
Now, Mr. Secretary, as we all know, the events in the Soviet Union or Russia, whatever we are going to decide to call it, this week are changing the face of the world. What is the American role going to be in this change in the next few weeks, months?
Well, David, I think the American role in this change has been significant to date, as a matter of fact, and I think that we have a very, very important part to play and role to play. That's not to say that the United States is in a position, or the West for that matter, to dictate the course of developments in the Soviet Union. But I know from the 2.5 years that I've been in this job that the leadership of the republics in the Soviet Union and the leadership of the center set a great deal of stock and store in improving relations with the United States and in what the positions and views of the United States are. So I think we will have a continuing role to play, and it will be an important role.
But it sounds like it's not exactly a leading role. We're hearing from the NATO allies, the European community, that they're ready to move ahead with aid to the Soviet Union, that they're ready to move ahead with recognition of the Baltics, and the United States seems to be lagging behind in that. Why is that?
I don't think that's true, Koki. I think that the United States has played the leading role and will continue to play the leading role because there is a great deal more. There's a great deal more importance attached by both the center and republic leaderships in the Soviet Union to what the United States thinks, frankly, than there is with respect to some other countries. And let me just say one thing, that I think what's happened, the explosive events over the course of the past week, really will present us, the United States and the rest of the West, as a matter of fact, with an opportunity to pursue an expanded agenda with the Soviet Union, and an agenda that is centered on reform. And I don't think that anyone should view the developments there over the course of this past week in anything but a very, very positive light, as far as the West is concerned and the principles which the West believes so strongly in.
Does that mean that we're ready to recognize the independence of various republics?
It means that with respect to your question about economic assistance, obviously, the political reform effort in the Soviet Union has far outpaced the the economic reform effort. Although I must say we were very encouraged to see some of the announcements coming out of Moscow yesterday with respect to the appointment of some of the people to the committee that's going to review once again the question of an economic reform plan. This will, I think, give us an opportunity perhaps to do more once we see clear determination on the part of the Soviet people to move toward reform. Now, you've just heard my colleague, the foreign minister of the Russian Republic, with whom I just met this week for the 4th time, say that they are committed to economic reform. And I frankly believe that they are. But what is needed is a concrete, specific program and plan that everyone signs on to. And that is what we have been encouraging, both in contacts with Republic leaders and leaders of the Union. Now, I think it's likely to come, and to come very soon. There's a Supreme Soviet meeting tomorrow, so maybe we'll see it very soon. That will enable us to do some more.
Mr. Secretary?
But we really need to see that determination.
Mr. Secretary, if I may ask you to be specific, who do you think is running the Soviet Union, or what used to be the Soviet Union now? Does it not appear to be Boris Yeltsin?
I think that President Yeltsin and President Gorbachev are now cooperating to run the Soviet Union. Clearly, President Yeltsin has significantly increased and enhanced stature as a result of his courageous performance at the barricades and in the White House. There will have to be, though, as things sort out there will have to be agreements entered into and arrangements made between Republic leaders and the center in order to determine what the respective responsibilities and jurisdictions of these governing authorities
Mr. Secretary, what do you make
That's going to be needed. Let me just finish one thing. That's going to be needed, frankly, before there can be meaningful Western investment, for instance, in the Soviet Union. We still do not know exactly where economic power resides. I think you're going to see a significant devolution of that power to the republics. That will be good. We will continue to encourage that. But it is at that point that I think you will see private businesses willing to invest in the Soviet Union.
Let me pursue the business of where the power lies at the moment one step more. What do you make of this thing about the Communist Party? Gorbachev clearly wanted to defend the Communist Party, wanted to preserve the Communist Party, until Yeltsin, in effect, told him, if you do, you're out.
What I make of that, quite frankly, is that President Gorbachev has come to the realization that communism is a failed ideology, something, of course, that we have been arguing for over 40 years, perhaps even longer than that, in this country. And we welcome that realization, and we're delighted to see that, because we happen to believe that.
What's going to happen to Castro now? He and Gus Hall are the last communists.
I don't know. There may be a couple. There may be one over in China, in North Korea, that you forgot about.
Kim Il-sung, father and son.
Kim Il-sung.
Aside from them, what about Cuba? The Soviet Union is now cutting them off, I understand.
I think you're going to see. That's what I mean when I say that what's happened over the course of the past week proves that democracy has taken hold in the Soviet Union. Now, hopefully, free market reform will take hold in the Soviet Union, and we will have a much greater opportunity to pursue an expanded agenda
when you talk about the
people on the basis of reform.
You talk about the republics. Are we about to recognize Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia?
Well, you heard the foreign minister of the Russian Republic say we've never ceased to recognize them, and we haven't. And they have representatives, in Washington.
We have not, Mr. Secretary. You know we have not.
With whom we always meet. Their flags fly in the lobby of our department. And let me tell you something else, Sam. What we want is independence for the Baltics. And as the President said in Kennebunkport, sooner rather than later. And we have been pushing very, very hard to achieve that.
If what you're telling me is that I'm in error, that we have in fact recognized them as independent states all this time, fine.
No,
tell me who the U.S. ambassadors are there.
What I said was we have ceased to recognize them. And we never ceased to recognize them. That's absolutely right. Now let me say.
Well, who's our next ambassador to Riga then?
For 2.5 years, Sam. For 2.5 years, we have been making the case as forcefully as we know how to the leadership of the Soviet Union that they would be far better off with 3 little Finlands on their border than they would be trying to keep the Baltic states as an integral part, in their view, of the Soviet Union. I now think that there's going to be an opportunity to see that happen. And what we want is concrete results, substantive results, and not just rhetoric. And I think we're going to get those substantive results, and we're going to continue to keep pushing for it.
Mr. Secretary, we just heard Mr. Kozyrev say that now that we're friends, he'd like to make a little criticism, which is that that our efforts have gone more towards the center, not towards the efforts towards reform,
Right.
and that he would like to see more of that. You keep talking about the needs for the Russians to act first, or the Soviets to act first in terms of market reform. Might it not be time for the United States to take a bolder action to shore them up so that they can get to market reform?
No, I didn't say they had to act on reform first. I said they had to demonstrate a determination that economic reform move forward just as they have that political reform move forward. But to be very honest with you, if the Soviet Union had embraced, for instance, the Yavlinsky plan in advance of the G7 summit, I think that the actions taken by the G7 countries might well have been very different. But they opted for the anti-crisis program of the center, which we don't think will result in economic reform. And we should not make the very same mistake that we made in the 70s with Poland, where we poured a lot of money down a rat hole. That doesn't mean that we're going to let people starve, or that the West should sit back and watch people starve. I think we ought to take note of something else. We have directed some of our humanitarian support in the past, some of our food assistance and medical support to the Baltic states and to the republics. We did that months ago. And I think you're going to see more and more of that as economic power devolves to the republics. Because we know that's where the source, we do know that that's where the source of political reform is centered now.
Mr. Secretary, lately you've been the busiest traveler since Marco Polo, I think. Do you plan to go to Moscow?
As things now stand, David, it would be my intention to now go forward with plans that I already had in train to attend the Human Rights Conference in Moscow around the 10th or 11th of September. So I would probably, I will be in Mexico on the 9th of September, and I would probably go to Moscow in the immediate aftermath of that to attend that Human Rights Conference, yes.
Well, thank you. Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for interrupting your vacation in that gorgeous place. I will understand if you decide not to come home. But thanks very much.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, David.
Coming next, our discussion here, and joining us will be ABC's senior foreign correspondent, normally in London, Pierre Salinger. In a moment. Sam, you asked about this a minute ago and didn't get an answer. I've just got it. Marshall Akrameyev did indeed leave a note when he committed suicide, shot himself in his apartment, in his office. It says, quote, "Everything I devoted my entire life to building is crumbling." Very sad. That's what he said.
A lot of people must be feeling that way.
Gorbachev's spokesman, who we just interviewed, apparently didn't know that.
I gather he didn't when you pushed him on it, and he didn't respond because he didn't know.
And I trust that Marlon Fitzwater will do better when we ask him.
Now, we're going to see a spread of representative, decent, honest democracy in the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe. What are we going to see?
We're going to see a complicated step towards democracy in the Soviet Union. Obviously, the abolition of the Communist Party creates the kind of situation that we've seen in some of the Eastern Bloc countries already. In most of them, the Communist Party has come back as a social democratic party or with another name and put itself into the context of a multi-party system. But when the voting came in all these countries like Bulgaria or Romania or other, except Romania probably, the Communist Party ended up getting 10% of the vote, which showed that they were never a very popular system in their own countries. And I think that's certainly true of the Soviet Union, even though we always saw it.
Guess what I know. Let me hear your guess. How many people in the Soviet Union, what percentage, supported communism, would you guess?
I would guess 10%, maximum 10%. Really? I think it was not the major party.
Well, we're going to see some sort of a union. I guess the structure, whether it's going to be like the British Empire or probably a little closer, is going to be worked out over a period of time. But clearly the republics are going to have their own governments, and they're going to have their own laws, and they're going to be autonomous to such a large extent that the union is just some collectivization for one or two items that a republic can't do for itself.
The British Commonwealth, for example.
It's going to be so...
Very successful.
Queen Mikhail Gorbachev.
That's right. I mean, that is the role that's going to be so interesting to watch evolve. I mean, we've watched it over the last 3 days as we've seen Yeltsin just take more and more power and literally dictate to Gorbachev, you know, read this. And,
those pictures of Yeltsin with his finger pointing, saying, read this, and Gorbachev
like a stern father,
back.
You know.
May I say a word for Gorbachev, though, as if it needed to be said? Gorbachev is sort of like Moses. Right. No offense meant to those who take the Bible very literally. But he didn't see the promised land either. Gorbachev, yes, was a communist who wanted to preserve communism, but he was smart enough to recognize that it had to change. And finally he came up against this divide in which you couldn't have a communist system and change enough.
He was the second communist leader to understand that there needed to be a fundamental change in the Soviet Union. The first one was Nikita Khrushchev, who in the late 50s started a reform program that was going to bring the Communist Party down, except he was doing it much, much too early. And he had not moved far enough to have significant power, and he got thrown out of power in 64.
Well, in 64, he was thrown out. But
until about 5 minutes ago, you had people in this town saying the same thing was bound to happen to Gorbachev. Right. And of course, last Monday, we thought that would happen from the right. And it's going to turn out to happen from the forces of democracy, not of totalitarianism.
Without what Gorbachev had done, the coup would have worked. But Gorbachev had stimulated a lot in the Soviet Union that brought the coup down.
2 years ago, the coup would have worked.
What happened yesterday would not have happened had Gorbachev never been in power in the Soviet Union.
Right.
That's correct.
He made it possible.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Also,
but it's
Gorbachev,
so tragic
David,
to be a transitional figure.
Well, also, Gorbachev's backing and filling, and is he a reformer, is he not, turns out to accomplish a purpose, and that is, 2 years ago, had Gorbachev moved very rapidly and this group of plotters moved, they probably would have succeeded, because the party apparatus, the apparatus and levers of power would still have been in place. But by chipping away with it, it came to the point where they couldn't succeed.
What does this mean to us? Does it mean great changes in the defense situation, industry, and so on in this country?
It certainly should. As it is, the defense budget is on a course that's now going to a point where it's lower than any spending since before World War II. The impetus to get U.S. troops out of Europe is enormous, both for budgetary reasons and for a sense that the Europeans should be defending themselves. But I think that now you really will have a tremendous move to start changing the defense industry, and that's going to cause a tremendous amount of turmoil in this country. It's one of our major industries.
Folks, sell short any defense industry that hasn't diversified, because we're not going to build B-2 bombers anymore. We're not going to pour billions and billions into weapon system against the dreaded, godless commies over there in Moscow. And may I say to my friend George F. Will, I hate to talk behind his back, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Well, George, we'll tell him what you said.
Right.
The right wing is going to have to hang it up as an anti-communist boo-boo-boo-boo-boo. You're going to have to find someone else to hate and someone else to say is a great threat to the United States. You don't have the commies anymore.
Well, let's be just a little careful. I mean, I don't disagree with you totally, but I will feel much better about the situation when I know there's control on nuclear power in the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that it's going to be moving into a lot of different republics. The possibility that it's all under control of a central government with no power, or it's under control of each of the republics, and then they get angry at each other and start an internal war.
You're exactly right.
Let's not write this off.
And there are 30,000 nuclear warheads there, which is the main reason that everyone was interested in stability in the Soviet Union to begin with. And, you know, keep in mind, a week ago, if we had had this conversation on Monday instead of today, we would be talking about vast increases in defense. We would be saying that a lot of these people who had been worried about the communist threat were right, that it had not disappeared at all. So that you really, you have to be very careful.
Dick Cheney had been saying that for some time. We don't want to cut back on our defense yet, because what's going to happen in the Soviet Union we can't predict, and it could be an overthrow by the hardline communists, and we could be confronted with the Cold War again. Now we're in a different situation.
Do you believe that another group of 8 is waiting in the wings and that they're going to come forward next Sunday, or tonight is Sunday night, and have another coup and be successful.
Let's see what happens in February.
What happened, we saw, was that the forces of democracy and the forces of reform are now so great in the Soviet Union, or at least the part of Russia that counts, that they're not going to go back. Yeah. Well, now, Pierre, I know that tomorrow we're not going to take down all of our nuclear missiles. That would be foolish. But it's clear that in the next months and years, we are not going to have to build these huge weapon systems that provide nothing in the way of productivity in this country, but sit in the ground at the cost to the taxpayers of billions.
Well, they provide jobs. They provide lots of jobs, and they provide lots of jobs in lots of congressional districts.
Boy, the merchants of death have provided jobs for centuries, but that's no reason to continue it, Koki.
Well, there's one small fact I think should not be lost to history, and it is that the plotters, when they were planning to try to overthrow Gorbachev, had their meetings in McDonald's hamburger in Moscow.
What do you think? Yeah, what would you think? I mean, I'm sure they're listening to us today. What do you think the KGB agents here in Washington, all over the world, who are not in the Soviet Union, what do you think they're thinking? You remember when the East German government crumbled and there were these Stasi agents, 30,000 of them around the world, and they didn't know what to do?
Well, a lot of them here in town.
I know they are. They're watching our show.
I bet they're wondering about how to get home or if they should go at all.
Well, they're going to say they never were real
got to go, folks. Thank you all
Your
very
heart
much.
was never in it.
We'll be back in a moment with a few words about what the Russians found in their grandmother's trunks in the attic in a moment. Finally, hardly anyone has ever seen this before. When this week Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev put on a ceremonious handshake, behind them was the flag of Russia before the communist revolution, the flag of the czars until the last czar was murdered. Almost no one now alive has ever seen it. It's red, white, and blue. Now, why those colors? Because those are the colors in the French flag, the tricolor. And one of the 18th century czars supposedly designed the flag himself, and he so admired France, he not only brought French ballet into Russia, where it remains, he copied their colors in a flag so simple, 3 stripes, 3 colors, that even a czar could have designed it. For a time, Russians were jailed for flying this flag, but this week, as soon as it was safe, they dug into their grandmother's trunks or somewhere, and out they came, all over the streets. So here's their new old flag, until this week, not seen for 74 years. So after an eventful and promising week for all of us here at ABC News, until next week, thank you.
This Week with David Brinkley, brought to you by ADM, Supermarket to the World, and by GE. From satellites to medical systems, we bring good things to life. If you wish a transcript, send $5 to This Week with David Brinkley, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007.
This Week with David Brinkley is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.